Hello, I'm Thelma English. Welcome back to British Literature. This is session 12. Good to have you back. We are going to be looking at Reformation and Renaissance literature today, and we're going to have a lot of fun with your syllabus reading. If you don't have a printed syllabus, you need to go to thelmaslibrary.com and select British Lit. There's a giant PDF file, which is the syllabus. It's more than 400 pages long. I do advise that you print that. I usually print them front and back. And when I refer to syllabus pages, that's what I'm referring to. It will include selections from all of the Reformation and Renaissance literature that we're looking at today in this PowerPoint. That's all available free at Thelma's Library. If you can't get in, I suppose you can send me an email and I may answer at thelmaslibrary.com is the correct email to send questions to. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the privilege of home education. I pray that today our 2 hours would not be wasted, but that it would be enlightening, that it would be fun, that we would enjoy this as Christians, and that we would feel better fit as Christians to shine in this world. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Let's get going with our Reformation and Renaissance literature. This is a very exciting period of time that we have come to. We'll pause the video for your devotion so that your volunteer from last week can read a selection from The Imitation of Christ. If you're joining midway for some reason, this is a book that I highly suggest that you obtain. I have a little sampler that I print up for some of my students, but I would suggest that you buy the book, The Imitation of Christ, Thomas à Kempis. It is amazing, and we choose to read one selection every week. If you are at home listening to this by yourself, then please pause for the devotion and read the devotion out loud to yourself. Thank you. Okay, let's get started again. Session 12. We will, go ahead and get your Much Ado About Nothing study guide turned in, please. Turn those into your parent, teacher, facilitator, whether you're handing it in on in person or whether you're emailing it to somebody. Let's get that done. We're going to be talking about the structure of a Shakespearean sonnet today, and you will be writing a sonnet, which is due next week or the week after. Your teacher can decide on that. We're putting together a classroom booklet, and someone will need to prepare some art for the cover. So cover art is welcome. Your sonnet is 5% of your second quarter grade, so that's not much, but you do need to write one. You will not be graded on the quality, but that you did it and it appears that you tried very hard. Not everyone is a poet, of course. Your reading this week is from the syllabus pages, that 430 or more pages that you have printed and 3-hole punched and put in a big 3-ring binder. We're reading a lot of syllabus pages this week, similar to the beginning of the year. We're reading pages 168 to 222. I have my section of, I have those pages, 168, and so it looks like this at the beginning. It has a big picture of a castle on it. 167 does. And so it looks like this. And I've got mine out and all stapled together so that we can look at these throughout class today. Coming up, that means next week, do bring your copy of As You Like It. Bring your Dover edition. If you have a Folger edition, I suppose you can use that, or another edition. Know that the Dover edition does divide the play, of course, into 5 acts, and it does divide the play into scenes, but it does not provide you with line numbers. So if you bring a fancier copy that has line numbers, it may be slightly different because not all copies of As You Like It are the same, but it probably will do. But I suggest you use the Dover edition so that we all match. So next week, you're turning in your sonnet unless you get a little more time. If next week is your Christmas break, Your teacher facilitator may choose to let you turn it in after Christmas so that you can have some fun with some artwork, and so that you can get started writing your Shakespearean sonnet and have a little more time to play with it. The cover art, if you're doing cover art for a classroom, black and white is best. It needs to be a portrait layout. We fold 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper in half and staple them in the middle to make the booklet. So your sonnet needs to be copy ready when you turn it in. It needs to be a half piece of paper. You fold a piece of paper in half as though you're making a booklet, as though it will be stapled in the middle, and have a cover on it, and you make your sonnet fit that page. That means you need to give it a margin about 1/2 inch all the way around, because your teacher, facilitator, parent will be putting these into a booklet, and we need some margin. Unless someone is okay with printing color, these need to be in black and white. Don't use pencil for drawing. I know lots of you are artists and you use a pencil for drawing. Pencil does not photocopy well at all. It will be a waste of your artistic talent. But do bring As You Like It with you next week. And then the quiz, the following week, session 14, for As You Like It, there is no paper assigned. It's just a plot element quiz. And optional online next week is to listen to me introduce each scene of As You Like It. Another option, if your teacher chooses that for today, session 12, would be to have people listen to that audio this week, or listen to that audio next week, session 13, or add an additional class that is not labeled in between session 13 and 14, and you could get together and read that out loud and take parts. That's what we do in my Shakespeare class. We assign parts and we get together. We read every word of every play. We read about 6 plays usually in the year, and read every word of every play. Right now I have my grandchildren and some of their friends in my living room learning Shakespeare this year, and we pass out parts and they all take a part and read through them, and we have a lot of fun with that. But you can listen to me introduce each scene of As You Like It, and then you'll be more than prepared to read it out loud as a class, or by yourself if you need to, if you're working alone. But after that, we move on to Paradise Lost. So if you want to view a film of As You Like It, you're going to need to add another class or another session so that you can do that and see a film of, As You Like It. I think I said Much Ado, of As You Like It. This is the last time we get to mention Chaucer, but I thought this was fun, and so I really wanted to share this with you. This is a last tribute to Chaucer that we'll be able to do, and this is written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whom I really admire, and I know you all know that. And it's just called Chaucer. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. If you took American Lit, which ideally I suppose you would take before British Lit, if you took American Lit, you know who Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is. He's a famous American poet from more than 100 years ago, and he wrote a poem about Chaucer. He says, "An old man in a lodge within a park, the chamber walls depicted all around, with portraitures of huntsman, hawk, and hound, and the hurt deer. He listeneth to the lark, whose song comes with the sunshine through the dark, of painted glass in leaden lattice bound. He listeneth, and he laugheth at the sound, then writeth in a book like any clerk. He is the poet of the dawn, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, and his old age made beautiful with song. And as I read, I hear the crowing cock, I hear the note of lark and linnet, and from every page rise odors of plowed field or flowery mead." That is quite the compliment to Chaucer. That Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is telling us that as he reads the Canterbury Tales, he can almost hear the cock crowing in the tale of Chanticleer. You've read some of these, and he can almost smell the plowed fields and the flowery mead. It's quite a tribute to Chaucer. We will be making a classroom edition booklet of sonnets. Sonnet information is in your syllabus. We'll be looking at that today, pages 249 and 250. They need to be copy ready, session 13. I say that, but if this is Christmas break, or if you want more time to do artwork, that's fine with me. This is something you can postpone, and it will not interrupt our other studies. So that's up to your parent or teacher when your sonnet needs to be copy ready. if you are doing artwork, whether or not you get to have a booklet or not, I hope to inspire you. I took a few pictures last night of some of the sonnet booklets that my students have made. This one is from 2009, 2010 sonnet cover, and I like it. It's just a castle. It looks very Renaissance. The image here on the left is what I have to do if nobody in class makes a sonnet cover. It has to be computer generated. It's kind of pathetic, back from 2002. And this one on the right from 2013 to 2014 is by a very artistic student, Ruth Spear, who, if you look her up on Instagram, I think she's got 150,000 followers now. She's quite an artist. Her name is Ruth Spear, double E's. But she did this cover for us about 9 years ago. And this is another computer generated one by someone who did the class remotely. And then the one on the right here was done by my own granddaughter, Sonnets 2019 to 2020. And that was fun. She did a great job of that. All right, we're looking at Reformation and Renaissance literature. And what on earth is that? We know it's kind of flowery, beautiful things. The first thing to talk about is Shakespeare. The first person, this is a small review of Shakespeare's work from last week that we talked about, the two theories for the genius of his work. Was he a genius, or did he just live at the right time at the right place? And I believe that both are true. He lived at the close of the Renaissance and Reformation, and that act of supremacy, you need to remember that. I always call it the royal hissy fit. And that's why we have Henry VIII here. The act of supremacy, 1534, was an act of the Parliament under King Henry VIII, declaring that he was the only supreme head on earth of the church in England. Remember, he was not going to be granted a divorce to marry the next woman. And so he stomped his little foot, or big foot, and demanded, well, I'll just make my own church and I'll be the head of my church. And that's why I call the act of supremacy the royal hissy fit. The doors to non-biblical subject matter had just been opened during the Renaissance. And that means we begin to see secular things that are funny just for fun, poetry that is not about God, all types of things that have nothing to do with God or his Bible. And then the key is the Caxton's printing press, which began rolling in 1476. And once Caxton starts printing, almost anyone can have a Bible, or many people can have Bibles anyway. So Shakespeare embodies all the best of both forces: Reformation morality, principles from the Bible, creativity and humor from Renaissance revived master storytellers. Think about it. How many plays by other authors from 400 years ago, or even 100 years ago, are still being performed on stage after 400 years? How many? I can't really think of any. Shakespeare gave the crowds what they wanted. They wanted to be entertained. They weren't as much interested in listening about to the Bible and about God. They really wanted to be entertained. Especially, think about it, this is in London. I don't know if you've ever been to London. London's a dreary place now. I was in London for a week about 10 years ago, and even then it was dreary, it was rainy. Of course, I went to London in November, but you're outside with your raincoats and everybody has their umbrellas up. And there are so many people in London, your umbrellas are all touching. It's a stinky, smelly place. And think how bad it was 400 years ago without modern electricity, without modern plumbing and all of that. Shakespeare was able to observe human nature, human character, and he capitalized on reflecting people in all situations. When he did tragedy, you felt it was really tragic. And when he did things that were romantic or comedic, you laughed or you thought it was precious. His poetry, you've got your Dover edition of the sonnet. It may look different than this. I'm not sure what the current cover is. Mine's really old and looks like that, William Shakespeare sonnets. But do get out your copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, the Dover edition. I'll be using Dover page numbers. His poetry brought him recognition before his plays. Think about it. Shakespeare called his plays his foul papers. He had no idea the plays were going to make him famous and that he would go down in history as a writer of plays. Very few people will pay much attention to Shakespeare's poetry, except in a classroom setting as we are now, or a college setting. However, plays, everybody loves to go see a good play, especially a comedy. In my Shakespeare class, with my grandchildren and their friends, we focus on comedies because what do you really want to see King Lear on stage with somebody poking their eyes out and screaming and bad weather and screaming at God and all of that? Or Macbeth, we do read Macbeth murdering people, a little 10-year-old boy. He's killed me, mother. Terrible, terrible things in some of the plays. But the comedies are hilarious. The comedies are fun. So he wrote a poem, a long poem called Venus and Adonis, to the Earl of Southampton. His dedication to the Earl of Southampton might have encouraged a substantial money gift. You write the poem. He doesn't exactly pay you to write the poem, but you write the poem and then he gifts you with this money. And that people have speculated. So maybe could have been, not probably, maybe could have been the seed money for his further investments. Now, right from syllabus page 250, we're going to be talking about rhythm and rhyme, which are the mechanical ingredients in a poem. Think about it. The moon is down, I cannot see the clock. That's just one line from Macbeth, but it's got rhythm and rhyme. That makes it easy to memorize a line, and it's kind of cool. The moon is down, I cannot see the clock. What a great way to say, I don't know what time it is. Great way. Words and creative imagery are a poem's artistic ingredients. I do not expect each of you to come up with a beautiful Shakespearean sonnet that will survive the next 400 years of critique, but I do expect you to do your best. Words are the poet's paint. He or she chooses carefully from his palette of words to paint an image on his canvas, which is the piece of paper. These words will give the poem character and individuality. They can reflect order and pattern, or disorder and chaos. And that's why some modern poets don't use capital letters, or they move the words around, even the arrangement of the words on the paper, for disorder or chaos, just to create what they want. Rhythm is a musical quality produced by the repetition of stressed and unstressed syllables, like from Macbeth, the moon is down, I cannot see the clock. Or think of twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. It's a musical quality when you get to poetry, and the sonnets are no exception. Rhythm and rhyme. Rhythm occurs in all forms of language, both written and spoken, but it's very important in poetry. Think of iambic pentameter. And I found this on the internet. I don't have an artist's name to give credit for this. Iambic. Iambic rhythm flows the best. It's fun and will appear on tests. The even numbers please the ear. The second, fourth, and sixth are dear. A line needs rhythm to be sweet. Iambic rhythm can't be beat, which is funny. Words evoke images, emotions, and shadowy depths of feeling. The properties of a word can be marvelous, endless, not to be guessed at from a casual inspection. And this is a fun way to write a poem, not a 14-line sonnet, but a more modern poem. This would fit very well, or even some type of a personal paper where you were sharing something very personal about yourself, or this would make beautiful artwork for the front of a card where you tell your own personal little story in the shape of a thumbprint. The properties of words have literal meaning. They have associations, they have connotation. Words have color, words have duration, words have shape, and words even have texture. Now, from syllabus page 256, 300 ways to say said. If you are a writer of stories, you write fiction, or you're writing a memoir, or writing even in your journal, you might want to think of other ways to say said. Instead of he said to the woman, he accused the woman, he acknowledged the woman, he acquiesced the woman, he acquired the woman, he added the woman, he admitted the woman, he admonished the woman, he advised the woman, he agreed, he alleged, he allowed, he alluded, he announced, he answered, he apologized, he appeased, he approved, he argued, he articulated, he asked, he assented, he asserted, he assured, he attributed, rather than saying said. Then from the B words, and you can do this clear through the alphabet. He babbled, he baited, or he barked, to her, he bawled to her, he began talking to her, he begged her, he believed her, he bellowed him, he beseeched him, he besought him, he bleated to her, he blubbered to her, he boasted to her, he bragged to him, he breathed to her, he broke in, he cackled, he cajoled, he calculated, he called, he cannonaded, he caroled, he cautioned. He challenged, he changed, he charged, he chatted, he cheered, he chided her, he chipped in, he choked her, he chortled her, he chuckled her, he chortled, he choked, he's instead of he said, oh my, he choked, oh my. He chortled, he chuckled, he churned, he cited, he claimed, he clamored, he coaxed, he comforted, she commented, she complained, she conceded, she concluded, she concurred, she confessed. Is that great? Just ways, instead of saying she said, think of how did they say it and say she chortled. Use a better word. Let's look at some of Shakespeare's poetry to see if we can do a little bit of inspiration here for you. And we'll look at Shakespeare's rhythm and rhyme, and then we'll look at Shakespeare's words. This is in your Dover edition, page 9. So open to page 9, please. And this is sonnet number 18. I realize your sonnets in the Dover edition, I believe they're still printed in Roman numerals, and that's really hard for me. That's why I'm giving you the page number. It's page 9. I really don't love Roman numerals when we have English numerals so easy. I've gone through my entire edition and rewritten the numerals in English numerals rather than Roman numerals. Here we have a 14-line poem, and the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B. So lines A and lines B and B rhyme, then C, D, C, D. So they don't rhyme with A, B, A, B anymore. They have their own rhymes. You see A and A are day and May. B and B are parate, a date is the other B. And C, D, C, D is shines and declines, dimmed, untrimmed. And then E, F, E, F, the EEs are fade and shade. And F and F are oast and thou growst. And then the GG, the rhyming couplet at the end, which is supposed to sum up all of the thought above. It's not just a continuation of the poem. It's supposed to be a summation. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So this poem will give life to this person forever. This is part of the first 126 sonnets, which are written to a young man. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines in time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Isn't that a great sonnet? This is one of my favorites. So even as long as people can breathe, they can read this. As long as they can see it to read it. And this gives life to this person even after he or she dies. Blank verse. Blank verse is just unrhymed iambic pentameter. By utilizing inverted word orders, Shakespeare could effectively place the metrical stress wherever he needed it most. So the syntax, the word order seems a little unstructured to us, but it's actually very structured. It does not follow our standard sentence, but Shakespeare has planned each word in its place on purpose. English is heavily dependent on vocal inflection, which is not so easily translated into writing to suggest emphasis and meaning. I think I have an alarm to turn off. I do. Iambic pentameter, a line of verse consisting of 5 metrical feet. Each metrical foot has 10 syllables, each foot consisting of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, or a short syllable followed by a long syllable. So stressed or long. Thus can my love excuse the slow offense of my dull bearer when from thee I speed. And this is sonnet 51. Remember, This sonnet was developed by Chaucer and then was perfected by Shakespeare. So this is what you're looking to write. 5 metrical feet, each line has 5 syllables. Divide the words up as you like, and you can see if you have one too many syllables, you just slash a word and omit a syllable or something, like what we do when we sing. And we say on heavens instead of singing on heaven's shore, we sing heaven's shore to get rid of one extra syllable that doesn't work in the music. Syntax, this is word order. The most common simple sentence in modern English follows a familiar pattern. You know this, you just don't say it like this. We have subject, verb, object, subject, verb, object. To illustrate this, we'll devise a subject. Our subject is John, and we'll come up with a verb, he caught. Object, ball, subject, verb, object. John caught ball. So we have an easily understood sentence. John caught the ball. We understand that very easily. Shakespeare used a great deal of sentence, subject, object, verb inversion, which renders the sentence as John the ball caught. But it sounds better. The order is commonly found in Germanic languages, more so in subordinate clauses, from which English derives much of its syntactical foundation. Look at this. Talk about tangled sentence structure or syntax. We have 6 ways to say the same thing. I ate the sandwich, and that's what we're used to. I, the sandwich, ate. Ate the sandwich I. Ate I the sandwich. The sandwich I ate. The sandwich ate I. Isn't that fun? Omissions. Shakespeare does this. You can do this. A few examples of his omissions or contractions that you might want to incorporate into your sonnet. If we want to say tis to replace it is, because we want to be more poetic, instead of it is 2 syllables, you can say tis time. To replace open, you can say ope. To replace over, you can say or. To replace give, you can just say give. To replace never is ne'er. To replace in is if. If you've read any Shakespeare plays, you've seen this used over and over again in the lines. To replace ever, it's er. To replace often, it's oft. To replace he, at. To replace even, in. To replace heaven, hen. And you can do that. Feel free to do that in your sonnet. And Shakespeare created his own words. If you need to create a word, as long as the word itself gives an idea of what it means, you can create your own word. Again, for the sake of his poetry, Shakespeare often left out letters. We call these omissions, or he left out syllables and whole words. These omissions really are not that much different from the way we speak today. Think about things we say today. Been to class yet? That's not a proper sentence. You would have to say, have you been to class yet? But we do this all the time. We omit. Been to class yet? No. Heard English is given a test. What's up with that? Instead of saying, have you been to class yet? No, I have not been to class. I heard that Mrs. English is giving a test today. What is up with that? We don't talk like that, and neither does Shakespeare. So he uses omissions so that the people talk as they really talked. We just have to get used to those figures of speech and those omissions. What is ellipsis? Ellipsis, you know the form of ellipsis that is 3 dots or 4 dots. You can look that up in your grammar book. We've talked about that on other occasions. But talking about ellipsis of words, ellipsis of words is the omission of one or more words which are assumed by the listener or the reader. For example, in Hamlet, we have a line, and he to England shall along with you. And he to England shall along with you. There's our meter, there's our iambic pentameter. He can't say, and he will go along to England with you. It's not the same, and it doesn't fit the meter or the rhyme or the rhythm I mean. What about alliteration? Everybody knows what that is. Slimy snakes sneak slovenly into, slithering slovenly into the S, something that starts with an S. You repeat the same initial consonant sound throughout the line of your verse. When to the sessions of sweet silent thought. That's alliteration. That's from Sonnet 30, which is another great sonnet. Then Sonnet 142. I'm showing an image of Sonnet 140. I see. Apologize for that error. You repeat anadiplosis. This is a great word, and it's a great thing to do. If you're creative, please try this. Repeat a word that ends one clause and repeat it at the beginning of the next clause. Now listen to this from Sonnet 142. Love is my sin, and thy dear virtue hate. Hate of my sin, grounded on sinful loving. So he uses sin and hate, and then he turns it around and says hate with sin. That would also be a chiasmus. The repetition of a word that ends one clause at the beginning of the next. Think of, this is from Richard III. My conscience hath 1,000 several tongues, and every tongue brings in a several tale, and every tale condemns me for a villain. So he ends a phrase with tongue, so he begins the next phrase with tongue. And then he ends that second phrase with tale, so he begins the third phrase with tale. You can try. Antithesis. It's a juxtaposition or contrast of ideas or words in a balanced or a parallel construction. For example, in Macbeth, the witches chant, fair is foul and foul is fair. This is antithesis. And later Macbeth comments on the occasion, so foul and fair a day I have not seen. And he means a foul looking day and fair things happening. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. Foul and fair are two opposites and set against each other. And yet it makes sense in the play line. So antithesis, Sonnet 18, lines 13 and 14, the last two form the rhyming couplet that sums up everything in the poem. We read this just a few minutes ago. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. Another contrast of ideas or words, antithesis. This is great in Julius Caesar, and another great play, especially if you are doing classical lit. If you do classical lit with me, when I create that class next fall, or this next fall, then Julius Caesar is a play you'll be reading. Great line. Trichiasmus. Hebrew poetry uses lots of chiasmus and parallelism. If you know me, you know that I did exegetical theology at Western Seminary here in Portland. And so when we learned about Hebrew poetry, and we did Hebrew and Greek because it was exegetical theology. And so we did it in the Hebrew, but two corresponding pairs arranged in a parallel inverse order. So he says, fair is foul. And then he says, and foul is fair. So this is chiasmus. It kind of forms an X if you draw a line from fair to fair and from foul to foul. And this is right out of Macbeth. What would you have? This is from As You Like It, and we're going to be reading this next week, getting into it. And this is from As You Like It. What would you have? And we have the gentle Duke Senior, who is a gentleman and a very nice guy. He's been run out of town right into the forest of Arden, where Shakespeare grew up, played, run into the forest of Arden with his merry men, kind of living like Robin Hood and his merry men. His younger brother has usurped him. And another character comes in, he's starving to death, and he jumps in and interrupts their bonfire and is starving for food. And the gentle Duke says, what would you have? Your gentleness shall force more than your force move us to gentleness. Again, one of my favorite lines from another great play. Sonnet 43, Dover, page 19. Sonnet 43. When most I wink, then do mine eyes best see. For all the day they view things unrespected, but when I sleep, in dreams they look on thee, and darkly bright are bright in dark directed. We'll talk about great lines. Try simile. This is an explicit comparison of two things using like or as. If you do classical lit with me next year, you know that Homeric similes are extremely long. These are very simple similes. My love is as, and there's the key word as, my love is as a fever, longing still for that which longer nurseth the disease. And malpropism. This is the scene, my favorite version of Much Ado About Nothing, directed by Kenneth Branagh, and that is Michael Keaton playing the character of Dogberry. And Dogberry, bless his heart, it's a confused use of words in which an appropriate word is replaced by one with similar sound, but often ludicrously inappropriate in meaning. For example, Dogberry says in Much Ado About Nothing, one word, sir, our watch, sir, have indeed comprehended two auspicious persons, and we would have them this morning examined before your worship. And of course, what he means, he says we've comprehended, and he means they've apprehended two suspicious people, but he says they've comprehended two auspicious persons. And this creates lots of humor. It makes Dogberry look stupid, but it creates lots and lots of humor with these malpropisms. All right, what about synecdoche? Synecdoche. The definition is the use or part for the whole or the whole for the part. For example, Macbeth gets really mad, and instead of saying, get out of here, he says, take thy face hence. And the face is for the whole. It means you get out of here. Sonnets 1 through 126 are written to the fair young man. Sonnets 127 through 154 are written to the dark lady. And you have them all in your edition. Was Shakespeare gay? People worry that because sonnets 1 through 126 are written to a fair young man, they're worried that these are Shakespeare's poems to another man, and that means he was gay. These were published in his lifetime, and the sin of homosexuality was punishable by, I think they hung them. You might have to look that up. I think it was a hanging offense. So you wouldn't really publish your love poems to another guy. So people they're out of history. They're out of sync with history when they decide Shakespeare is gay. And American readers especially do not understand how European men express their love. When I've taken groups to Europe before, and inevitably the girls have no problems sharing a bed, two girls in a bed, and we can get 4 people in a room then, 2 beds, 2 double or 2 queen beds, and you've got 4 girls sleeping in those. But can you get 4 guys to sleep in those 2 beds? Nope. They will take turns, one sleep in the bed and the other sleep on the floor. Because American guys won't do it. But then when you get to Europe, if you go to Italy, for example, if you go to Italy, even now, you'll be out in the middle of a big public square and some burly looking guy rides up on his motorcycle, sees his friend, he gets off his motorcycle, takes off his helmet, he's got spiky things around his neck and his wallet chained to his pocket. I mean, you know, and he's dressed in black leather, he looks really rough and tough, and he sees his friend and he says, oh, you know, my friend, and starts hugging him and kissing him on the face. So we Americans put everything in the context of our own time, our own age, our own culture. And American culture is not European culture. So you have to get rid of that idea of just jumping to the conclusion that Shakespeare was gay. Of course, if you are gay, if you're homosexual, then you'll see everything in Shakespeare you'll see as gay, because of course you're looking for that. Nori Epstein, this is a cool Shakespeare book. I gave away quite a few of these and I suggest students buy them, but some of this is untrue. It's just really easy to read. Epstein, Friendly Shakespeare, and then Harold Bloom, who wrote The Invention of the Human, they both think that Shakespeare was gay, but they are not the top of the line Shakespeare scholars, and they're both very liberal literary scholars. So I disagree with them, and I stand with traditional scholars. The only indication that we have that Shakespeare could have been gay comes from those sonnets written to the young man. In the early sonnets, Shakespeare writes about his great love, who happens to be a young man. But is it really Shakespeare? Are these really written from Shakespeare to another man that he knows? Or are these poems written from someone else, written by Shakespeare for someone else? His plays do not depict actions of his own life. So why would we expect that his poetry and each sonnet would also depict his own personal life and then have them printed for all people to read? While many modern readers think this means he had a male lover and was gay or bisexual, let me remind you, it was illegal and it was not something you would write down in poetry and publish. There are others who still believe that his male friend was not a lover, but someone who was simply very close to him emotionally. And think of what I told you about those Italian guys, the way they express, "I love you, brother." Yes, you know, people people read Merchant of Venice and they decide that Antony and we'll be reading in a few weeks, that they are lovers. People read all types of plays and they decide that the male guys who are really good friends must be homosexual. We'll never know for certain because there's almost no biographical information about Shakespeare's personal life. And male friendships were often extremely close and expressed as such. And were the sonnets really biographical? Is that why Shakespeare wrote them, as biography information on himself? The first folio of plays was published in 1623, just 7 years after Shakespeare's death. Now, this supports the idea that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. I realize there are all types of mini documentaries out there trying to prove theories that Shakespeare didn't write the plays. One of them takes an outline of Shakespeare and lays it on top of Queen Elizabeth I and says it's identical, that she actually wrote the plays. And somebody else is Edward de Vere. There are all types of possibilities. This didn't even happen until about 150 years ago. I think Mark Twain was one of the first people, Samuel Clemens, who decided that Shakespeare could not have written Shakespeare. It was just too good. It was too professional. It was too good. He wasn't educated enough. He couldn't have written the plays. And so somebody must have else have written them. And so you have all these conspiracy type documentaries, but serious Shakespearean scholars have never doubted his authorship. Each of those suggestions just doesn't work. Edward de Vere died, and there were still more plays written after that. That would be a little bit of a difficulty. Many were still alive in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare died, when the first folio came out, and they would have been refuting Shakespeare's authorship, saying he didn't write that. You would have had all types of people saying that, and we don't see that. You have to apply all the right rules. All conservative scholarship accepts Shakespeare as author. There is no evidence to support any other theory. Shakespeare's contemporary rival, Robert Greene, made reference to Shakespeare as an upstart crow, beautified by our feathers. So here he is, another writer, and he's mad at Shakespeare. He says he's beautified by our feathers. Because Shakespeare borrows things. They didn't have plagiarism. But that is also during Shakespeare's lifetime, and that would be support for Shakespeare's authorship. The first folio, 1623, you need to know that. 7 years after his death, you need to know the date of the folio, 1623. It was put together by a couple of friends who realized this is ultimately lost. That no one will even know that these are his plays if we don't, put them all together and put them in a book. The last time that a folio was sold, I just looked it up. This is the year 2022. And the last time that a folio was sold, it was in 2020, 2 years ago, and it sold for $10 million. It has 36 of the 37 plays generally attributed to Shakespeare, with Pericles being omitted. $10 million. Syllabus pages 240 to 246 contain mini plot summaries of every play. Know where that is, mark it somehow. If you see that a play is going to be performed somewhere at a college or a high school or at a summer outdoor Shakespeare festival, anything like that, you need the plot summary to know whether you want to go see it. You might even mark all the comedies. I really do not enjoy the tragedies anymore. I don't enjoy going to see Shakespearean tragedies. I can just watch the daily news if I want tragedy. Page 247 of your syllabus has this sketch of the Globe Theater. This is by a former student, Adrienne Anderson, and I just love her sketch with all types of little notes and things. I had to make it a slide for this. So you've got plot summaries of every play. Your syllabus reading this week, page 168 to 222 and 160. Well, 167 has the little castle yard on it. And if you go to page 168, it has a picture of Notre Dame, which of course just a few years ago burnt down, and they're rebuilding Notre Dame. I hope they get it all done. It's costing not a small fortune, but a large fortune. Parts of it burnt down. It was really a miracle that the whole place didn't burn down. If they do rebuild it and you have a chance to go visit Notre Dame, you really should. It's absolutely amazing. Everything is carved in stone. If you couldn't read, you would know the Bible stories just by what's carved in stone. Absolutely amazing, giant place. All right, you're going to be reading in your syllabus reading the Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica. No, you're not going to read the whole thing. Praise God. Yes, Summa Theologica means the sum of all knowledge. And so Thomas Aquinas, way back in the 1200s, thought that he was going to write the sum of all knowledge. And he writes about ethics, what is right and wrong. He writes about natural law, in case you don't understand it. And he writes about political theory. How should we govern? And you might even extrapolate that out into how should we live? How should we then live? He was an Italian Catholic Dominican order priest. He's an important philosopher and theologian. His Summa was to have been the sum of all knowledge. He is very Catholic, very much Catholic, and belongs to the Catholic Church. He's had a great influence on Western thought in the area of ethics. In other words, what is morally correct? Natural law and political theory. How should we govern? Political theory. How should we govern? What is right to do? And remember, he's writing during a time of kings and queens. And so this would not apply in America, but he's writing in a time in Europe when this is of great importance. And today, if you're going to get anything out of it this week when you read it, you can think about how should we then live, which was what Francis Schaeffer wrote in 1976. I would highly suggest everybody watch that. It ended up being turned into a, I don't know, 4-part or 10-part documentary type series that you can probably watch on YouTube for free. But how should we then live? With what we know of what the Bible teaches, how should we govern people? And we could consider how should we then live? Ethics, for example, look at syllabus page 169. Syllabus page 169. We're in the second column, the column on the right, and he says objective number 3. Further, Jerome, and of course he's talking about Saint Jerome, who lived in the AD 300s through 420, an early Christian writer and a monk. We'll be talking about him in just a few minutes from now. Further, Jerome, he's quoting Jerome, says, shun as you would the plague, a cleric from whom being poor has become wealthy, or who from being a nobody has become a celebrity. Wow. Okay, so you think, that's not the one on the screen here, but what a great ethics question. And he says, if you meet somebody in the church who should be poor from giving everything away, and they're wealthy, or they should be indiscreet, and from being a nobody, they've become a celebrity, run from them like you would the plague. And he's writing in a time where there was plague occasionally breaking out. So when he says, shun as you would the plague, he's serious. The ethics example that we have, let's see, about a tradesman is, on the left-hand column, page 169, the left-hand column at the bottom. Whether in trading, it is lawful to sell a thing at a higher price than what was paid for it. Is that lawful? And then he's going to quote John Chrysostom. And there is a footnote to tell you John Chrysostom lived in the 300s to 400s, and he was a Greek church father. John Chrysostom, if you take seminary, you'll have to, and do some church history, you'll be reading John Chrysostom, I can't pronounce his name, Chrysostom. But don't think this is boring reading this week. Don't think it's boring. I don't want to do this. Realize this is your chance. You're probably never going to pick up a copy of Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica and start reading through it. So this is your opportunity to know, what is he talking about? He's talking about, is it okay for a clerical person, a religious person, to get rich and to become famous? No, run from them like the plague. And his other example, when you're trading, is it okay to sell something at a higher price than you paid for it? Is that okay? Now, we do that all the time here in America because that's capitalism. People buy things, they buy things in bulk to get them cheaper, and then they sell them at a higher price. People still get a better price than they could get it all by themselves if they had to grow it or go out and find it somewhere, or certainly if they had to import it. But is that okay? Is that okay? Especially if you're a Christian selling things to Christians. Is it okay? And of course, you have to go all the way back 800 years ago to the time period of Thomas Aquinas and say, was that okay if you buy something then to sell it for a higher price than what you paid for it? And another example, whether it's a sin to take usury for money lent. Now, syllabus page 170, follow along with me, go to syllabus page 170. And it's quite interesting when he starts talking about usury. Let's see. The sin of usury. It's in the right-hand column. The sin of usury. We must now consider the sin of usury, which is committed in loans. Oh, when you loan someone money. Now, when you read this section on usury, you're going to find out that he calls money interest if you think usury is lawful, and he's going to call it usury if you think it's unlawful. Is it a sin to take usury for money lent? If you loan money to someone, is it okay to take usury, to take interest? Is that okay? If you loan someone money, is it okay to collect interest on that? And you have to decide, does the Bible talk about that? And the Bible does talk about that. So I challenge you to look at the verses that are brought up. Let's see. He gives you all types of verses you can look up, and you may or may not recognize the Bible abbreviations, but this is pretty cool stuff. Another example, whether it's lawful to borrow money. Okay, is it okay to loan money at interest? Is it lawful to borrow money under a condition of usury? Is it okay for you to borrow money and then pay it back with usury? That you're borrowing money and paying usury if you're anyone who owns a credit card, because you're being charged interest, even if it's only 2 or 3%. And your house payment, now in 2022, your house payment may be at 6%. Is it lawful to borrow money if you have to pay 6% interest back? Is that okay? Is it okay to borrow money from a Christian? If you loan money to a Christian, should you charge them usury? And he is going to attack all of these issues, which are very real for us today. If you look at syllabus page 171, syllabus page 171 in the second column, reply to objective number 2, the Jews were forbidden to take usury from their brethren, in other words, from other Jews. By this, we are given to understand that to take usury from any man is evil simply because we ought to treat every man as our neighbor and brother, especially in the state of the gospel, whereto all are called. Hence it is said without any distinction in Psalm 14, verse 5, he that hath not put out his money to usury, and then in Ezekiel 18:8, who hath not taken usury, it's referring to someone. They were permitted, however, to take usury from foreigners, not as though it were lawful, but in order to avoid a greater evil, lest to wit, through avarice, to which they are prone to, according to Isaiah, they should take usury from the Jews who were worshipers of God. So is it okay to borrow money from a pagan and pay interest, or is it okay to loan money to a pagan and charge interest? Is it okay to loan money to a brother and charge interest? And he's attacking all of these questions. These were very pertinent questions in the AD 1200s. Aquinas learned the Aristotelian theory of knowledge derived from reason from Albert Magnus. He added to this the concept of higher knowledge from revelation. So Aristotelian means having to do with Aristotle. If you take classical lit next year, you'll know about Aristotle, you'll know about the 10 things. First you find out what it is, you'll know all about Aristotle, or you'll know enough anyway. So he learned this Aristotelian theory from a teacher, Albert Magnus. And then Aquinas added to that theory the concept of higher knowledge from revelation, because Aristotle, 300 BC, had no idea, 350 BC maybe, Aristotle had no idea of revelation, of the revealed scriptures. And so Aquinas adds to this concept the higher knowledge you can get from revelation. So you have to add to this Aristotelian theory God's revelation, which means the Bible. You've got to add that to it. In the Summa, his last and greatest work, Aquinas discusses the nature, attributes, and relations of God and man. His teaching was decreed by Pope Leo XIII to be the basis of Catholic theology. If you're Catholic, I'm probably going to offend you. If you're Protestant, I do have to tell you that this was a terrible decision to base Catholic theology on a man, Thomas Aquinas, from 800 years ago, rather than to base Catholic theology on the theology, say, of Paul or of Jesus Christ, the New Testament. They believe they kind of sort of do that. If you're Catholic, I'm sorry, I'm offending you. However, I do challenge Thomas Aquinas up against the Bible. It underlies all subsequent political and social inquiry into the position of man in the universe. The Summa does. The first complete edition appeared in 1485. This note is from your syllabus, page 173. As I mentioned, I have mine all stapled together. And you'll see the little word text box on page 173 that there's a picture of Aquinas, and in the text box, you see Aristotelian theory of knowledge derived from reason, but to it, he added his own concept of higher knowledge derived from revelation. This is really important too. Aquinas was a priest, turned into a lawyer, and then he was a lawyer, turned into a theologian. That does make him a good theologian, with the idea of inquiry that a law degree requires. However, doing anything from a man, from his Summa, rather than from the New Testament or Old Testament, is really a wrong direction. All right, next up, Dante Alighieri. And he is Italian, so we're not going to spend too much time on him, but many Brit lit classes, or sometimes they call it an English lit class, you read Dante, you read the Divine Comedy, one part of it or another, and that doesn't seem right to read something that was Italian translated into English when you can read Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is definitely the Protestant book of choice to read starting next week or the week after that we have chosen. And that's all due to my friend, Dr. Jan Haluska. I think I had a slide of him last week. He has passed on just a few years ago. But he said to me in an email one time, why would you read Dante? It's very Catholic, and it was written in Italian, when you can read John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is Protestant and written in English. And I made my decision. I thought, you're right. So we can thank Dr. Haluska for that. God rest his soul forever. So Dante Alighieri is an Italian poet from Florence. His Divine Comedy is a masterpiece of medieval literature. Now think about it. What's so important about Florence? He's from Florence. Remember, when we talk about the Renaissance and the Reformation, we talk about the Reformation taking place in the North, primarily Germany and Switzerland, and we talk about, and France, and we talk about the Southern Europe being the hotbed for the Renaissance, specifically Italy, specifically the city of, yes, Florence. So he's from Florence. masterpiece of medieval literature. Beginning on syllabus page 174, we're exploring Dante. So syllabus page 174, I printed mine in color. This is an article from Christian History magazine. It's from issue 70, and I did mine in color because it's great. And this article does such a good job of explaining Dante for us. So we're reading this article from Christian History magazine. The Divine Comedy is a Catholic vision of the afterlife, and it's a composite of the medieval worldview. So it helps you to understand that whole thing about a hierarchy, because here in hell, you have a hierarchy in hell. So the very worst of worst of worst of worst sinners, who would that be? Judas Iscariot. He's going to be at the very bottom pit of hell. Isn't that great? It's only a comedy. Don't think it's going to be funny. It's only a comedy in the medieval sense of having a fortunate ending. It doesn't have a happy, thrilling ending like Shakespeare with a little wedding at the end and everybody falls in love and gets married at the end. But it has a fortunate ending. It's not a tragedy. So it's a comedy. The comedy is divided into 3 parts. The Inferno, hell, and we're reading a sample from that, and you're going to love it. And then Purgatorio, which is in between. Now, if you're Protestant, you have heaven and hell. But if you're Catholic, you have purgatory, also the in-between place. Paradisio, paradise or heaven. So it's divided into these 3 parts. The purpose of the comedy, says Dante in a letter written to somebody, is to remove those living in this life from the state of misery and to lead them to the state of bliss. There are more than 14,000 lines in the Divine Comedy. Each section has 33 cantos. That means it's really a big fat book. You can get used copies or you can read it free online. We're only reading 7 or 8 cantos from the Inferno. So we are reading a sample from the Inferno, the hell part, which is more fun. And so here you have a beautiful artist rendition of hell. And Dante is getting this firsthand look at all the layers of everything and how people are, marching down into hell, and there's flames, and you can see Satan in the lower left there coming up to get people. Dante, his personal life, he was contracted to marry at age 12. This is your parents picked who you're going to marry. Later in his life, he fell in love with a young woman named Beatrice. Now, he never even we don't think he even ever spoke to her. He watched her from afar. Remember courtly love from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where the person, you don't even have to talk to them. You can just admire them from afar. So he fell in love with Beatrice, and she was his idea of an angel in a heavenly form, in the form of a young woman. In the poem, the Roman poet Virgil. Now, if you haven't taken classical lit yet, you don't know who Virgil is. Virgil wrote the Aeneid in the 1st century, and we read that in classical lit. So the Aeneid is after Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and the Aeneid presumes that in the Iliad that a prince survives. Aeneas is his name, so the book's called Aeneid, and he goes to start a new big city because Troy's all burned down, and he ends up in Rome, where he starts a new city, which is the city of Rome. So in the poem, Virgil, it's kind of like a dream vision, and the Roman poet Virgil comes to him and guides Dante, who is our 4th century poet, so 1400 years apart. So Virgil comes and he guides Dante through the realms of hell and purgatory. The young idealized woman, Beatrice, leads Dante through paradise, because that's where she belongs. Dante tells the story of his journey in 1st-person dialogue. I went here, I went there, I did this, I did that. The divisions of hell in Dante. There are 9 circles of hell. There's upper hell, the first 5 circles, for the self-indulgent sins. And then circles 6 and 7, those are for the violent sins. Circles 8 and 9 are for malicious sins. You can see sins of treachery, falsifiers, sowers of scandal, fraudulent counselors, thieves, hypocrites, barrators, deniers, magicians, flatterers, panderers, seducers, fraud, against God, sodomites, usurers, blasphemers, things against themselves, poor people who commit suicide. And of course, this is part of where the Catholic idea that if you commit suicide, you can't go to heaven, which is really unfortunate to tell people that. All of these things, if you can read them all the way up, the heretics, all these people all go to hell. The 9 layers: treason, fraud, violence, heresy, wrath, and sloth, avarice, gluttony. Those who are really big and fat go to hell for gluttony, lust, and then we see limbo. The sinners in hell are all guilty of one or more of those 7 deadly sins. Remember the 7 deadly sins from syllabus page 141? Those 7 deadly sins. The people in hell are all guilty of one or more of those. 4 of the circles of hell are devoted to punishing these sins in their various manifestations. So circle 2 is for those who lusted. Circle 3 is all filled with fat, dead people. Circle 4 is for greedy people, and circle 5 is for angry, wrathful people. The remaining circles don't exactly correspond to the 7 deadly sins, but these you can see are very similar in thought. The Inferno, the reason that we're reading a little bit from the Inferno, which is really, really fun, is because of the sign over the gates of hell. And I've had many students who have gone home and remade this sign to be the sign over their bedroom door. The sign over the gates of hell says, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." This is a picture of Gustave Doré's illustration of the gloomy wood. And here he goes in. But when you go through that gate, that's what it says over the gate. "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." And so it makes a great sign for a teen's bedroom, if you've got a messy bedroom. The suffering sinners that Dante encounters in the Inferno are each punished in a fashion suitable for their crime. The most severe punishments are reserved for the residents of the lower depths of hell, of course, the worst people. "Scarce the ascent began," says Dante, "when lo, a panther, nimble, light, and covered with a speckled skin, appeared. Now, when it saw me, vanished. And he replied, seeing my soul in tears," excuse me, let's go to syllabus page 180. Syllabus page 180, and this is in the left-hand column, very near the bottom. "And he replied, seeing my soul in tears, he must go by another way who would escape this wilderness. For that mad beast that flees before you there suffers no man to pass. Tracks down all, kills all, and knows no glut." So she never gets filled. She just keeps killing and eating. "But feeding, she grows hungrier than she was. She mates with any beast and will mate with more before the greyhound." What's the greyhound? You've got a little note of what the greyhound is before the greyhound. Perhaps a reference to the rulers of Verona. So this is a personal smack. "Comes to hunt her down. He will not feed on lands nor loot, but honor and love and wisdom will make straight his way." And so this is what it keeps going on in this manner. It really is fun to read. And we're not reading that. We're only reading 7 or 8 cantos. So please enjoy it. You can see there's the panther, nimble and light, in this slide, getting ready to eat anybody who comes that way. Now, next in our medieval Renaissance sampling is Francesco Petrarch. Petrarch is such a cool guy. We end up calling him the father of humanism. He's a humanist. He's not Christian. He's an Italian poet and scholar of the 14th century. Petrarch's sonnets were admired and imitated throughout Europe. They even get their own name. It's a Petrarchian sonnet. It's not a Shakespearean, it's a Petrarchian sonnet. And his writings became a model for lyrical poetry. And he grew up, guess where? Near Florence. the center of the Renaissance. We're reading part of Petrarch's Secret on pages 194 to 205. Let's go to page 194, please. 194. This is a fun guy. You can see that page 193 is really just pictures from a book of backgrounds of European literature, which is a great book. It's an old one. You have that as a note on that page 193. So on page 194, in the first column, you can see Francesco Petrarch, My Secret, the founder of humanism. That's what we call him, the founder of humanism. His imaginary dialogue with St. Augustine is what My Secret is about. And this is really sad. If you have taken classical lit, you know that at the very end of the year in the springtime, we read St. Augustine's Confessions. He died, I believe, AD 410, right around there, as the walls of Rome are being broken down by the Visigoths and the Vandals. And he's writing the Confessions. And Augustine's Confessions has been a pattern for hundreds, if not thousands, who confess. He's confessing his sins to God, and he says, but you, God, knew what you were doing when you let me do this, or when I did this. And he confesses every little tiny minor sin, sometimes to the point that it's almost boring to read, but most of it is quite beautiful. And Petrarch is imagining that he's having a dialogue with St. Augustine, that 4th century scholar and one of the first theologians of the early church. It is Augustine in his On the Trinity. It's an essay, a longer essay called On the Trinity, who describes the Trinity as one in substance, 3 in function. And I don't know that I've actually heard a better definition of the Trinity. So simply put, so we're reading part of his My Secret. And remember, he's talking to St. Augustine. In responding to Augustine's questions, Petrarch tries to justify his own life and to examine his own beliefs. In doing so, he calls into question many of the everyday values of his society, as well as its abstract generalizations about life and religious beliefs. And this is straight from page 194, the top of the second column. And you can see the second column on syllabus page 194, book 1. Augustine says, oh, what are you doing, poor little man? What are you dreaming? What do you look forward to? Have you then forgotten all your miseries? Don't you remember that you're mortal? And Francesco Petrarch replies, certainly I remember it. In fact, that thought never comes to me without bringing a twinge of terror. And then they go on with their conversation. And if you are a Christian, I think you will find that it's a little bit on the sad side because it's humanism. He's moving away from thinking that God has the answers to thinking that the answers are going to be found himself. After climbing one of the Alpine mountains, Petrarch writes, I closed the book. And he's talking about Augustine's Confessions. I closed the book, angry with myself that I should still be admiring earthly things, who might long ago have learned from even the pagan philosophers that nothing is wonderful but the soul, which, when great itself, finds nothing great outside itself. Then in truth, I was satisfied that I had seen enough of the mountain. So he climbs this mountain, and then he closes Augustine's Confessions, and he gets kind of mad at himself that he thinks he could learn something from going out in nature, when in reality, all he needed was the wonder of his soul, great in itself, with nothing great outside of it. And he'd seen enough of the mountain. He didn't need to go out on the mountain to experience God or anything like that. It is kind of sad. I turned my inward eye upon myself, and from that time, not a syllable fell from my lips until we reached the bottom again of that mountain. We look about us for what is to be found only within. We're all searching for something, looking around. What we're looking for, of course, is looking for God. But Petrarch says, we're all looking for what's to be found only inside yourself. This is very much like William Wordsworth. How many times, think you, did I turn back that day to glance at the summit of the mountain, which seemed scarcely a cubit high compared with the range of human contemplation? So he looks back that day at the mountain and he says, wow, that's really nothing compared with human thought. Well, I agree. God's miracle of our brains is much more of a miracle than even a high, beautiful mountain. However, to think that it is your own is rather something different. This is from a book called The Italian Renaissance. And that short selection from Petrarch's journal gets reprinted in mountaineering journals because he talks about going up on mountains and coming down and finding that all he really needed was himself. It's just kind of interesting. All right, Giovanni Boccaccio. All right, Boccaccio. We're going to meet Boccaccio this week also. He wrote a biography of Dante, whom he greatly admired. Boccaccio corresponded with Petrarch. With Boccaccio, we move from medieval to Renaissance. So go to syllabus page 206, please, for Giovanni Boccaccio. 206. Isn't this great reading? This is really quite a sample. This is very similar to what you would get had you been reading a textbook this year. We just read the stack of books and we read this. All right, so if you go to syllabus page 206, you've got a picture there of Boccaccio. And we're talking about the Decameron, which is extremely important. We'll be reading bits and pieces from this, all about love, honor, pride, and all types of interesting stories. The Decameron is a collection of 100 stories written just prior to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So guess who inspired Chaucer? He was inspired by the Decameron. And of course, Chaucer didn't finish all his tales, but that was his inspiration. The Decameron, if you've done a little bit of Greek, Greek is pretty easy. It's really easier than learning Spanish because you don't learn that many words. If you learn New Testament Greek, there just aren't that many words in the New Testament. You don't have to learn how to say, where is the bathroom, in the New Testament. In Greek, deca is 10 and hemera is day. For example, if you're in Greece and you say kalimera, it means, good day to you. So deca and hemera, decameron, decamera is 10 days. 10 young people spend 10 days in an Italian villa. So it's the 10 days away from the city while plague is running rampant. So plague is running rampant. You're going to be reading about plague this week. They each tell 10 stories during these 10 days, and that makes 100 stories. In the year of our blessed Savior's incarnation, 1348, that memorable plague ravaged the excellent city, far beyond the rest in Italy, which plague, by operation of the heavenly bodies, or rather for our enormous iniquities by the just anger of God, was sent to us mortals. And that's right from page 1207. You're going to read about plague. It's really fascinating. He says, right on page 207, he says, once they start bleeding from the nose or get these big things in their underarms or in their groin and they start, bleeding, they're doomed, they're going to die. And he talks about just how horrible it is. Families being divided, where even parents leaving their children because the children have it and they're all going to die and the parents don't want to get it and the parents leave. People doing just horrible things rather than staying together, and the horrible things that people did trying to avoid the plague. So you're going to be reading all about plague. Fun. All right, let's move on now to John Calvin. We've moved up to the 1500s. John Calvin, the French theologian of the Protestant Reformation. So we talk about the North with Germany, Switzerland, and throw in France there. We're reading his letter to King Francis, and you'll find that on syllabus page 215. Go to syllabus page 215, and you have this same picture of John Calvin, who wrote the Institutes, and you're reading his letter. And he says, I want to teach them he says, sir, when I first engaged in this work, now he's talking to the king, nothing was farther from my thoughts than to write what should afterwards be presented to your majesty. My intention was only to furnish a kind of rudiments by which those who feel some interest in religion might be trained to true godliness. As I toiled at the task, chiefly for the sake of my countrymen, the French, multitudes of whom I perceived to be hungering and thirsting after Christ, while very few seemed to have been duly imbued with even a slender knowledge of him. So everybody wants to know about Jesus, but nobody knows a thing. This is what he's telling the king. This is really a pretty cool letter. That was the object with which I had in view is apparent from the work itself, which is written in a simple and elementary form adopted for instruction. So his Institutes ends up being this great big old book. You must get a copy. It's absolutely amazing. You will really enjoy John Calvin talking about the Bible and talking about Jesus. And he says, then I ended up putting it together so that we can use it for instruction. Calvin's Institutes is a systematic Protestant theology. Editions appeared about 1536. He addresses the sacraments, so communion, justification by faith instead of works, and God's sovereignty, that God knows. He knows whether you're going to heaven or hell. He knows he's not popular with Catholics. He knows what your choices will be. You do have free will, but he already knows what you're going to choose. And that's hard for some people to think about. The English Bible, I threw this in here because we have a little bit of extra time. And so we're going to do a little bit of an overview because the English Bible falls right in there with the Renaissance and Reformation, the history of the Bible from about 1500 BC to AD 1600 or 1611 with the King James Version. Because the Bible, the history of the Bible goes from Hebrew. First, it's written in Hebrew, it goes to Greek, it goes from Greek to Latin, and then it goes from Latin to English. Amazing, really. So go back to the 1440s BC. The Exodus is 1446 BC when Moses takes everybody out of Egypt, and then they wander around for 40 years. And then 1406, they leave the desert and go through the promised land. And by about 14, I hope I'm doing this math right, 46 to 1406 would be going into the promised land. And it took them about 6 or 7 years to get all the promised land. And then they start living there. And then Moses and Caleb are dead, and they start picking judges. And then when they kind of run out of judges working and everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes, then they want a king. And then you kind of know the history of the Bible after that. Then they have kings. And then they, after Solomon, then you've got Rehoboam, his son, and Jeroboam, his, counselor, political worker, then ruling. And you've got a southern kingdom ruled by his son, and the northern 10 tribes ruled by the other guy. And you have then the downfall of the northern kingdom in 722 when the Assyrians kind of take them out, scatter them all over the world and plant other people in there. And then you go for, now think where you have to count backwards, go to 586 BC, and the little southern kingdom is down there surviving, the kingdom of Judah, and they're just barely surviving in 586, and the Babylonians come and carry them all off to Babylon for 70 years. So you kind of have to know that little bit of history. And that's another class. That's in my Old Testament survey. So Moses puts together the Pentateuch during this time when they're out in the desert, these 1440s BC, puts the Pentateuch together. He writes out the 10 Commandments. They're there in Exodus 20, and then all those people die off. And just before they go into the promised land again, in Deuteronomy 5, he writes them out again and is kind of the retelling of the law. The second telling, Deuteronomy, Deuteronomos. So the second telling of the law is Deuteronomy, because all the old guys died and the new guys, before they go into the promised land, they need to learn the law. So Moses is his editor. He's the author. He's compiling any primary source records into one work as God directs him. On the right here, you can see Genesis 1, chapter 1, the first 3 verses of the Old Testament in Hebrew. Hebrew goes right to left. How do you like writing mirrored kind of backwards? I thought that was kind of fun. So you've got Bereshit, bara, Elohim, et hashamayim, and haaretz. So the water and the land. In the beginning, God created. And so Hebrew is written right to left. Now, I took you through the history. I did it in about 90 seconds? I took you all the way to 586 BC. So now we have the little kingdom of Judah that's surviving, the little Judah, where Jerusalem is, taken into captivity into Babylon, and they're going to be held there. Remember Jeremiah 25, he said, don't worry, you'll only be there 70 years. And they didn't really like Jeremiah. So they go into captivity into Babylon. That's modern day Iraq. And in Babylon, they were speaking Aramaic. The exiles remained in Babylon under the Medo-Persian Empire, and there began to speak Aramaic. So first they were there in Babylon. Then the Persians took over Babylon, and then they were under Persians. They were still in the same place. And that was Cyrus, who took over, and Cyrus let anybody who wanted to go back home go home. But you can see there the Fertile Crescent, which instead of green on this map, it should be green, it's orange. That's the Fertile Crescent. It's a crescent shaped piece of land that's very fertile because it has the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers running through it. And so if you drag your captives off, you can see the left there, Jerusalem by the Dead Sea, and you have to take them all the way to Babylon. You can't just take them straight across the desert, you'll all die. You have to walk across the Fertile Crescent so that you're near water all the time so you can survive. And so they took them all to Babylon. So not very many people came back home after that. And while they're there, many of them, maybe most of them, lose the ability to read and speak Hebrew, the language of their own sacred literature. And this is what's Iraq today. And people think, well, why are there Jews in Iraq today? Well, this is why. This is their history. They've been there for a long, long time. So many of them forget how to speak Hebrew, and they start speaking Aramaic because their captors are speaking Aramaic. Now the Septuagint, or called the LXX, which is 70, about 275 BC, nobody has a specific date, about 275 BC, the 39 Hebrew Bible books are translated into Greek by 72 Jewish scholars. Now this is really cool. If you take New Testament survey, or if you take Old Testament survey from me, you'll learn the reasons this is so cool and how important it is that it was Jewish scholars who translated all of this, so that later, after Jesus was born in another 270 years, that they will not be able to say, well, Christians changed the Septuagint and did this, because it was Hebrew scholars who translated the Septuagint. This text is the Greek version of Exodus chapter 20. This is where the 10 Commandments are. It's important for us to remember that the LXX was prepared by Hebrew scholars, but at least it's left to right. Thank you, Lord. In the 1st century AD, completion of all original Greek manuscripts that make up the 27 books of the New Testament were done by the end of the 1st century AD. Sometimes this is called the time of the disciples, the apostles, the apostolic age, because we think that the Apostle John died about AD 99 or AD 100. He lived the longest. He's the only disciple who was not martyred. And we call this the apostolic age. All 27 books in the New Testament are done. When John dies, that's the end of the apostolic age, and we enter the early church father age after AD 100. Now, this is Codex Sinaiticus from about the time of Jerome's, I see a typo there, about the time of Jerome's Vulgate Latin Bible, about AD 330s. So this is about 220 years after John is dead, 220 years. This codex is written in Greek, and it lives in the British Library. I've seen it. If you go to the British Library, it's not very far from John Lennon's original handwritten lyrics to, I think it's to Imagine. And I asked a guard, where was Codex Sinaiticus? And he didn't know, but he did know where John Lennon's lyrics were. And I kind of worried about that. And I thought, wow, if this place burns down someday, then they're going to be grabbing John Lennon's handwritten lyrics and not the Codex Sinaiticus. It just means it was found at the base of Mount Sinai, so it ended up being called Codex Sinaiticus, so that you know which one it is. And it's all written in Greek. It's just a beautiful, absolutely beautiful copy. You can go to the British Library. They have an awesome website, and you can go to the British Library and you can actually turn the pages of Codex Sinaiticus virtually. It's all beautifully photographed now. So if it ever is lost to time, there will be a digital copy. Now let's talk about Jerome. As the centuries after the resurrection unfolded, the dominant language spoken in the Roman Empire began to change. No longer was Greek the dominant language. In 382, Pope Damascus, therefore, commissioned Jerome to translate the Bible into Latin, a task that took him about 20 years to complete. This Bible came to be known as the Version Vulgata, which the Vulga means the common. common translation and became standard for the Western Church. In English, we call this Bible the Vulgate Bible. And Jerome is the guy. He's the Bible translator whose version of the Bible, Latin, lasted for a millennium, 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, his version was the version. His travels took him around the world, to Alexandria and finally to Bethlehem, where he settled to live in a monastery. There he translated the Old and New Testaments into Latin. The story is quite long. I can only give you a few details, but this would be cool to look up in the library. This translation was recognized 11 centuries later at the Council of Trent as the official version of the Bible, the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate. In AD 406, Jerome completed his translation of the Bible into Latin, including his own translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew. He went to Bethlehem and learned Hebrew. Jerome's earliest translations of the Hebrew Bible were based upon the Septuagint, the Greek copy. However, about 393, he turned to manuscripts written in the original Hebrew, because by then he was very fluent with Hebrew and thought, I really should be translating these from the Hebrew. And there are websites dedicated to Jerome, and you can look up and see which books of the Old Testament he translated, most of it, and which ones he translated from the Septuagint, from the Greek, and which ones he translated from original Hebrew manuscripts. His copy is extremely important because it shows what the manuscripts were like in AD 300, and that makes it extremely important for people who try to say that things are changed. There are scholars out there. You can look them up on YouTube. You can look up Daniel, it's the wrong class, Old Testament Survey. There are scholars that are absolutely convinced that we have 99.9% of the New Testament as it was written, that there are just a few things here or there, and most of them are words like and, or but. And so in the original Greek and Hebrew, not in English. English translations, you can fight all you want over to which is the best. You really should learn a little Greek so that you can check out those things. Jerome's translation. Now, Augustine argued that by using Hebrew manuscripts, Jerome was driving a wedge between Christians of the East and West, because the Greek-speaking Christians of the East were using the Septuagint, which was Greek. And I think that's kind of funny. If you read about Jerome and Augustine, you could look up Jerome and Augustine letters to one another. There is a church history set. I think it's 36 volumes. I've got it on my shelf, but I can't see it from here. And there are letters, the recorded letters of Jerome writing to Augustine and Augustine writing to Jerome. And Augustine says things like, why are you interested in that filthy language Hebrew that the Jews use? It's just really derogatory toward the Jews. And Jerome is a much older man, writes back to Augustine and says, why don't you pick on somebody your own age? I'm too busy to argue with you. He doesn't say it like that. He says it better than that, but it's really cool to read these letters. And then this piece of artwork is by Leonardo da Vinci, and it's in the Vatican museums. Bede, let's talk about Bede. He had translated the book of John into Old English into Anglo-Saxon, like Beowulf. Bede translated the book of John into Anglo-Saxon like Beowulf, but no copies have survived. We just have people writing about it that he did it. AD 600, Latin was the only language allowed for scripture. They really thought everything had to be Latin. They were completely against English. Isn't that something? The Anglo-Saxon translations. This is the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, as given in the West Saxon Gospels. So a little bit later after Bede, but this is the Anglo-Saxon Gospels, and they are beautiful manuscripts. All right, let's get to John Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation. He completed his translation directly from the Latin Vulgate into the vernacular, the common language of English, Middle English, in the year 1382. So this is, Chaucer died AD 1400. So this is 8 years before Chaucer dies. So this is the same kind of English that Chaucer is. If you were able to figure out some of Chaucer's Middle English, you could figure out some of John Wycliffe's English Bible. in the year 1382. And then we now call that the Wycliffe Bible. Isn't this cool? So whereas Bede was made a saint, Wycliffe was declared a heretic by the Roman Catholic Church, primarily because he challenged the doctrine of transubstantiation and the papacy. The papacy, of course, is the idea of having popes, that Peter was the first pope and so on. And that's another class. The idea of transubstantiation is that when you take communion, that it looks like bread and it looks like wine or grape juice. It tastes like bread, tastes like wine or grape juice, but after the priest blesses it, even though it looks like bread and grape juice or wine, it actually is the blood of Christ. It actually is the body of Christ. And that's why the leftovers from communion have to go into a special place, usually some type of reliquary, kept under lock and key, so that if somebody, say, who's dying and you're a priest and you've got to rush to their bedside to do last communion, you need to have some pre-blessed bread and wine, and you take it from there and take it on your mission with you. And sometimes the priest, rather than accidentally spill the wine, they just drink the rest of it. All right, from the Protestant perspective, however, Wycliffe has been called the morning star of the Reformation. In 1428, after Wycliffe was declared a heretic, they exhumed his body. They couldn't do anything to him because he'd already died. From a couple of strokes, I think. The last little bit of his life, he couldn't even speak anymore. But he was dead. But they were really mad at him. So they declared him a heretic. They dug up his body from consecrated ground and they burned him up, and then they threw him in the river. And that is what you do, I guess, to really your enemy. Then Gutenberg invents the printing press, AD 1455. And you'll see different years for the printing press. Excuse me. You'll see different years suggested. And it kind of depends on your history book. I'm not going to argue with anybody on this. With the printing press, everything explodes. The first book ever printed is Gutenberg's Bible in Latin. Books may now be mass produced instead of individually handwritten, sewn and all of that. Well, they're still sewing the leaves together, but they can be mass produced. This is really an amazing event in history. AD 1516, Erasmus produces a Greek-Latin parallel New Testament. So now this is 500 years ago, and we're getting into some really high-tech stuff. A Greek-Latin parallel New Testament. So you can compare your Latin with your Greek. Some of you might have an English-Greek parallel New Testament. If they're in parallel columns, we call it a parallel New Testament. If they have the English under the Greek, then it's called an interlinear. There's another word for when they're on opposite pages, but I can't remember what it is. AD 1522, Martin Luther's German New Testament. AD 1526, William Tyndale's New Testament, the first scholarly New Testament printed in the English language, translated from the Greek. Future translations were largely based upon his work, upon Tyndale's work. Future translations went back to his work and used that. AD 1560, we're to modernity pretty much here. The Geneva Bible, the first English language Bible to add numbered verses to each chapter. Thank you, God. Now we have verse numbers. 500 years ago, we got verse numbers. Thank you, Lord. And the Geneva Bible, you can read. If you can read Shakespeare, you can read the Geneva Bible, and you can read the King James Version of the Bible. I have a copy of it, the Geneva Bible. It was a gift from a student, and it is beautifully written. And the King James Bible, published in 1611. Shakespeare died in 1616. And so if you can read Shakespeare, you can read the King James Version of the Bible, not the New King James, the original King James. The New American Standard Bible then came out in 1971, NASB, New American Standard Bible, and they took care of things like thine and thou dost and thee, and changed it to you, things you and your, things like that. And once you leave the Greek anyway, you don't have the masculine or feminine pronouns, so it really doesn't matter. There's no sense using thine instead of your. to say thine excellence, you might as well say your excellence, because you can't tell whether that's masculine or feminine in any English version. You've got to go to the Greek. Then the New International Version was in 1973. This came out when I was your age, but I was already accustomed to the King James Version. Everything I've memorized, all the little ditty songs I know, they're all from the King James Version, even though I use ESV and New American Standard Bible. But the NIV came out when I was your age. It's called a modern and accurate phrase for phrase English translation of the Bible. It's not a word for word translation. So the NIV is never used for scholarly studies. It's used for reading. And it's excellent for young people. It's used for reading, that you would not try to do word studies in the NIV. You'd need to use New American Standard and then be able to do a little bit of Greek to do that. The New King James Version came out in 1982, and they got rid of some of the oldest language, and it made it a little easier to read. And then in 2002, the ESV came out, and this is your moment. Amazing scholarship in that ESV. I know it's giant. Get a hardback copy and put it on your shelf and use it just for reference. You've got like 50 reference books smashed in there. You have some of the most incredible maps and illustrations and study notes and translator notes. You have all types of fascinating things in there that you just can't get without a whole bunch of other books. Everybody should have a copy of that ESV. And I do like ESV for some of the verses. For example, in Genesis 3, I like the ESV better than the New American Standard, but that's another class. That is Old Testament Survey. And just to get you kind of excited here, you can buy a Dead Sea Scroll fragment. This is a little tiny piece. It's 4 centimeters wide. It's Nehemiah 3, verses 14 and 15, and it is available for 6 figures. That means over $100,000. You could have this little scrap from the Dead Sea Scroll. Isn't that cool? Okay, next week, bring your copy of As You Like It next week to class. Please bring your copy. And the Lord bless you. Have a good afternoon or evening or morning, and I will see you next week.